Your toddler is crying. Maybe they're upset about leaving the park, frustrated that they can't have another snack, or overwhelmed by a feeling they can't name. Your response is quick and well practiced. You pull out your phone and show them a video. You offer a toy. You suggest a new activity. You get them a snack. Within seconds, the crying stops. It feels like success. It feels like good parenting. But neuroscience shows that when we use distraction as our primary response to emotional distress, we're accidentally interrupting a critical brain process that toddlers need to complete. And over time, this pattern can create more emotional reactivity, not less. If you find yourself reaching for distraction the moment your toddler gets upset, or if you've noticed that your child seems to become distressed more easily or recover more slowly over time, this video will help you understand what's happening in their developing brain and what research suggests we do instead. You are not harming your child by using distraction. This is one of the most common and culturally normalized parenting responses. It's recommended in parenting groups, modeled by other caregivers, and it works in the immediate moment. The intention behind it is always caring. You want to stop your child's suffering. You want to help them feel better quickly. You're trying to move through difficult moments efficiently so everyone can return to calm. These are all reasonable, loving goals. But the toddler brain processes distraction differently than we realize, and understanding that difference allows us to respond in ways that actually build emotional capacity rather than accidentally preventing it from developing. The reason these early years matter so much for this particular pattern is because this is when the brain is learning its fundamental responses to emotional distress. Between birth and age 3, your child's nervous system is building the neural pathways that will determine how they handle uncomfortable feelings, whether they can tolerate emotional discomfort, and whether they learn to move through emotions or learn to escape them. The experiences they have now, especially the repeated patterns during moments of distress, are literally shaping the architecture of their emotional brain. Research in developmental neuroscience shows that emotional regulation is not something we teach toddlers through words or strategies. It's something their brain learns through repeated experience of having an emotion, feeling it fully, and then naturally returning to baseline. This process has a biological component. When your toddler becomes upset, their body releases stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline. Their heart rate increases, their breathing changes, their nervous system activates. This is a normal, healthy response to emotional distress. What happens next is critical. If the emotion is allowed to complete its natural arc, those stress hormones get metabolized, the nervous system discharges the activation, and the body returns to calm. The brain learns through this experience that emotions are temporary, that distress has a beginning, middle, and end, and that the child has the capacity to move through the cycle. This is not something that happens once and becomes learned. It requires hundreds of repetitions during these early years. Each time a toddler feels upset and then naturally returns to calm, the neural pathways associated with emotional regulation get stronger. But this can only happen if the process is allowed to complete. When we interrupt the emotional cycle with distraction before it's had a chance to run its course, we prevent the brain from building these essential pathways. The toddler never learns that feelings pass on their own. They learn instead that uncomfortable emotions must be immediately escaped or avoided. The first way that distraction affects the developing brain shows up in how it teaches children to relate to their own emotional experience. When a toddler is crying and the parent immediately offers a toy, a screen, a snack, or a change of activity, the implicit message is that this feeling is not okay to have. It's something that must be stopped right away. Parents use distraction because it's effective at stopping the behavior. The crying ends, the child's attention shifts, everyone feels relieved. But neuroscience shows what's happening beneath that surface behavioral change. The stress hormones that were released during the initial upset don't disappear just because attention has shifted. They're still in the child's body. The emotion hasn't been processed or completed. It's been suppressed. The child's nervous system was in the middle of an activation cycle, and that cycle got interrupted rather than resolved. Over time, with repeated interruptions, the brain learns a pattern. It learns that uncomfortable feelings are dangerous and must be immediately avoided. It learns that the way to handle distress is to escape it rather than move through it. Developmental psychology finds that children who are frequently distracted from emotional distress often become more emotionally reactive over time, not less. They develop lower tolerance for uncomfortable feelings because their brain never got to practice sitting with discomfort and discovering it's temporary and survivable. They may become more easily overwhelmed, recover more slowly when upset, or develop heightened sensitivity to distress because their nervous system never learned the complete cycle of activation and natural return to baseline. The long-term effect is an individual who struggles with emotional avoidance, who may reach for distraction compulsively when any uncomfortable feeling arises, who has difficulty sitting with boredom, disappointment, frustration, or sadness, and who may develop anxiety precisely because they've never learned that difficult feelings are something they can tolerate. The distraction that felt like kindness in the moment accidentally taught them to fear their own emotional experience. What to do instead is allow some time for the feeling to exist before you offer any redirection. When your toddler is upset, your first response is simply presence. You move close, you sit nearby, your body is calm. You might place a gentle hand on their back if they accept touch. You don't immediately try to stop the crying or shift their attention. You give their nervous system 2 or 3 minutes to be in the feeling while you remain steady beside them. You're not ignoring them. You're witnessing them. You're allowing the emotional process to begin. After those few minutes, if they're still very distressed and the intensity isn't decreasing, then you might offer gentle redirection, but you've given their brain the essential experience of feeling something difficult with a calm person nearby, which is what builds the neural pathways for actual emotional regulation. The second pattern appears in how frequent distraction prevents children from developing internal resources for managing emotional discomfort. When a toddler experiences distress and the parent immediately provides external stimulation to capture attention, the child's brain learns to look outside themselves for emotional management. They learn that when something feels bad inside, the solution comes from outside. Parents use distraction this way because it seems to work. The child stops crying. They appear happy again. It feels like we've solved the problem. But research in emotional development shows that resilience and emotional regulation are internal capacities that must be built through practice. When we consistently provide external solutions to internal distress, we prevent the child from developing their own capacity to self-soothe, to wait, to tolerate discomfort, and to find their way back to calm using their own internal resources. The brain is incredibly plastic during these early years. It's learning what to rely on. If the pattern is always that distress equals immediate external intervention, the neural pathways for internal regulation simply don't get built because they're never being used. Neuroscience finds that children need repeated experiences of feeling uncomfortable and then discovering that they can manage it, that they can sit with it, that they have some capacity within themselves to tolerate and eventually resolve the feeling. This doesn't mean leaving them alone with overwhelming emotions. It means providing your calm presence as support while they practice using their own developing regulatory capacity. Your presence is the scaffold, but they're doing the work of regulation themselves, which is what allows those neural pathways to form. The hidden long-term effect is someone who becomes dependent on external stimulation or distraction to manage any uncomfortable internal state. They may struggle with being alone, with quiet moments, with boredom, or with any situation where they're left with their own thoughts and feelings without immediate access to distraction. They never developed confidence in their own capacity to manage discomfort because that capacity was never allowed to develop. This can manifest as compulsive phone use, difficulty with stillness, constant need for entertainment or stimulation, or significant anxiety when external distractions aren't available. What to do instead is offer your regulated presence as the primary intervention, and let that be enough for a while. When your toddler is upset, you stay close with calm energy. You're not doing anything to them or for them in that moment. You're simply being with them. Your steady nervous system is the resource you're offering, not toys or screens or snacks. This feels harder than distraction because the crying continues for longer. But what's happening is that their brain is practicing. It's learning that distress can exist, that it's not dangerous, that it will pass, and that they have some internal capacity to be with it until it does. Over many repetitions, this builds genuine self-soothing ability rather than dependence on external rescue. The third impact of habitual distraction shows up in how it affects the brain's learning about emotional communication. When a toddler cries, they are communicating. They're telling you that something feels wrong, that they're overwhelmed, that they need something. This is the only language their developing brain has for complex internal states. When we respond to that communication by immediately redirecting their attention elsewhere, we're essentially saying that what they were trying to communicate doesn't matter or isn't worth our attention. Parents don't mean this at all. They're trying to help, but the toddler brain interprets patterns, not intentions. Parents reach for distraction because they feel helpless in the face of crying. They don't know what else to do. The crying feels purposeless or manipulative. They think that if the child can be distracted, then the original upset wasn't that important. They're trying to teach the child not to get upset over small things, but developmental psychology shows that toddlers don't cry over small things from their perspective. Their emotional brain doesn't yet have the capacity to evaluate whether something is worth being upset about. When they cry, it's because they genuinely feel distressed, and that distress is real regardless of whether we think the trigger was significant. When we dismiss that communication by immediately distracting, their brain learns that their emotional signals aren't important, that their internal experience doesn't warrant response, and that the way to handle communication that makes others uncomfortable is to stop communicating. Neuroscience finds that children who experience their emotional communication as consistently redirected rather than received often develop either suppressed emotional expression,
where they stop showing distress because they've learned it won't be heard, or escalated emotional expression, where they cry harder and longer because their initial signals never get an adequate response. Either pattern comes from the same source, which is that the brain learned its emotional communication wasn't being received as meaningful. The long-term effect is difficulty with emotional expression and communication in relationships. These individuals may struggle to identify what they feel, to communicate needs effectively, to trust that others will respond to their distress, or to believe that their emotional experience matters. They learned early that their attempts to communicate internal distress were something to be redirected away from, rather than received and responded to. What to do instead is receive the communication first before offering anything else. When your toddler cries, you acknowledge it. You might say something very simple like "you're upset" or "something feels hard right now." You're not trying to fix it yet. You're receiving the message they're sending. You're showing them that their communication matters, that you heard it, that their internal experience is worth your attention. This takes maybe 30 seconds. Then after that acknowledgement, if distraction or redirection would be genuinely helpful, you can offer it. But the sequence matters. Receive first, then redirect if needed. This teaches them that their emotional communication is valid and meaningful, even when the solution eventually involves moving attention to something else. The fourth way distraction affects emotional development is in what it teaches about the nature of emotions themselves. When parents consistently use distraction to stop crying, children's brains begin to form beliefs about what emotions are and how they should be handled. The pattern they experience is that uncomfortable feelings must be immediately eliminated, that distress is intolerable, and that the appropriate response to any negative emotion is to make it go away as quickly as possible. Parents use distraction because they've been taught that dwelling on negative emotions makes them worse, that it's healthier to focus on positive things, and that helping a child shift attention to something pleasant is a form of emotional support. This sounds reasonable from an adult cognitive perspective, but research in developmental neuroscience shows that this approach misunderstands how emotional processing works in the young brain. Emotions are not problems to be solved or eliminated. They're neurological processes that have a natural beginning, peak, and resolution. When we interrupt that process repeatedly through distraction, children never learn that emotions have a natural lifespan. They never discover that if you simply allow a feeling to exist without fighting it or fleeing from it, it will rise, peak, and then naturally subside on its own. Neuroscience finds that children who are given space to complete emotional cycles develop what's called distress tolerance. They learn experientially that uncomfortable feelings are temporary, that they won't be destroyed by sadness or frustration or disappointment, and that they have the capacity to experience negative emotions without needing to immediately escape them. Children who are consistently distracted from emotions don't develop this tolerance. Their window of emotional tolerance actually becomes narrower because they've never practiced expanding it. The hidden long-term effect is heightened emotional reactivity and increased anxiety. These individuals experience any negative emotion as intolerable because they never learned it's something they can simply be with. They may develop significant anxiety about experiencing negative feelings, which creates more anxiety. They may engage in compulsive avoidance behaviors, constantly seeking distraction from their internal experience. The very thing that felt like protecting them from emotional pain in childhood created more emotional suffering long-term because they never developed the capacity to be with discomfort. What to do instead is allow emotions to complete their natural cycle before offering any change in focus. When your toddler is upset, you stay present with calm energy and you wait. You're not forcing them to stay in distress. You're simply not rushing to pull them out of it. You let their nervous system do what it's designed to do, which is activate in response to distress and then naturally return to baseline. This might take 3 minutes. It might take 5. Your job is to remain regulated beside them while this happens. After the intensity has peaked and begun to come down on its own, then you might offer gentle redirection if it feels appropriate. But you've given their brain the foundational experience it needs, which is completing an emotional cycle from start to finish. With hundreds of repetitions of this experience, they develop genuine resilience. Here's how emotional resilience and regulation actually develop in the young brain. It's not through learning to quickly shift attention away from distress. It's not through avoiding uncomfortable feelings or immediately replacing them with pleasant ones. It's through the repeated experience of having an emotion, feeling it fully in the body, and then discovering that it naturally resolves and that you survived it. It's through learning that your own nervous system has the capacity to activate and return to baseline without requiring external rescue. It's through building the neural pathways that come specifically from practicing the complete emotional cycle again and again with the safety of a calm, regulated caregiver nearby. The timing of when you offer distraction matters enormously. Distraction can be a helpful tool after an emotion has been acknowledged and partially processed. It becomes problematic when it's the immediate first response that prevents the emotional process from even beginning. The difference is those few minutes of presence before redirection. Those minutes are when the essential learning happens. This doesn't mean you never distract your toddler. It means you understand the sequence. Presence first, acknowledgement first. A few minutes for the feeling to exist and begin its natural resolution. Then, if distraction would be helpful for transition or moving forward, you offer it. The brain gets what it needs from those first few minutes. The learning happens in that space where the feeling was allowed to exist before it was redirected. Your instinct to stop your child's crying comes from love. Your desire to help them feel better quickly is not wrong, but understanding how the emotional brain actually develops develops its capacity for regulation allows us to help in ways that build genuine resilience rather than accidentally preventing it. Your toddler doesn't need you to immediately eliminate every uncomfortable feeling. They need you to stay calm while they experience those feelings. They need space to learn that emotions have a beginning, middle, and end. They need to discover through experience that they can feel upset and return to okay without requiring someone to rescue them from the feeling itself. This is harder in the moment than reaching for distraction. The crying lasts longer. You have to tolerate your own discomfort at witnessing their distress. You have to trust the process when everything in you wants to make it stop. But this is the work that builds emotional health. This is what creates children who grow into adults with genuine capacity for emotional regulation rather than sophisticated avoidance strategies. You will not do this perfectly. You will reach for distraction sometimes when presence would have served them better. You will interrupt emotional processes because you're tired or overwhelmed or just trying to get through the day. Every parent does. What matters is that you understand the principle and move toward it more often than not. A few minutes of presence before distraction, acknowledgement before redirection, allowing the feeling some space to exist before offering the shift in attention. If this changes how you think about your responses to your toddler's distress, consider sharing it with another parent who might be caught in the same pattern. And stay here for more calm, science-based guidance on supporting your child's brain development in ways that build genuine emotional capacity and resilience.